Claire, with your story, so I'm thinking now of facts. Yours is about facts. We've understood that from the outset. It's true story. But, of course, as you say, quite hard to sift through sometimes and find the actual story, to drill down and think what did actually happen here. And sometimes you have to take leaps, don't you, to kind of work it out. Yes. And I'm thinking of B. Dawson here. Her comment to me was, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. I remember... history of gardening and all. Where is Bee sitting?
She's
somewhere.
There.
Where is she? There. Do you remember saying that, Bee? Or was that just me? That's right. I think I misquoted. Never let veracity get in the way of a good story. So there is that to be thought about a little bit, isn't it, in writing a story like this? Not that you're necessarily going to invent in the broader sense, but you're going to have to use your imagination a bit, do you think?
Well, I prefer to use the word interpretation. That you don't actually embellish it, that you interpret the facts in the way that you think is most logical. So, I say that someone was a very successful businesswoman because I've read comments in newspapers or whatever about how her profits and that type of thing. I think it's quite hard, and that's the hard thing too when you're interviewing people and they tell you something, you think that cannot be right. And you go back and look and it's not, and then you think, well, I've got to go with what's accurate, not with what they've told me. But you have to present it in such a way that they're not offended and that you are giving their side of the story, because they're the ones who've lived in the garden or experienced the garden. And also, of course, like with Jane, well, not Jane specifically, but when you're interviewing people who have lived somewhere when they were very young, they see things in a completely different way to perhaps an adult and to someone looking at it from outside. So, yeah, I wouldn't like to say I made a good story at the expense of facts. I just think it's the way I interpret it that makes it a good story.
So you mean like it's sort of an educated guess, isn't it, based on what you know
yes,
and the context? And
yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Do you find that it helps to go there? I'm thinking of Redma, who talks about, who's in the back there, who talks about, walking the walk, going to those places and feeling them, and that helps with the storytelling.
Right. You mean Catherine Mansfield walking those?
Yeah, but for you, obviously not Catherine Mansfield. We're talking going to the gardens, going to the places.
Yes, it did. It did
where
help.
People live.
It did, and it helped thinking back to what the gardens were like, because of course they'd changed a lot. I mean, some of them were, or most of them were over 100 years old. So you had to think back to what they were like, and also what life was like for the people who were living there at the time, because most of the gardens were rural gardens, and so the people, and the women specifically, were very isolated, really. And so these gardens were a wonderful sort of haven for them. They could entertain friends, they could play croquet, they had often had 2 tennis courts, croquet lawn, they had beautiful rose gardens to wander in. So you sort of have to see, and it can be quite difficult because you are walking in the steps, but what's left is nothing like what was made. When you have a team of gardeners, you can do something quite amazing, but when it's just you, it's not the same.
So you have to use your imagination there about how it would have been.
Yes, yeah, and imagine what it was like for those people, and doing things that we don't do now, like hunts and things that racing over fields and all that sort of thing, which is what they did in some of those gardens.
Yeah. I mean, it was like when we were at Homewood up here in Karori, where we had the launch of the book. And, of course, we know that a Buxton garden always had a good rose garden, didn't it? And yet there hasn't been one of late, but they've just revived it.
Yes, they have, because apparently the British High Commissioner, the current one, is very keen on gardening, and she wanted a rose garden. So that's really nice, actually. Because, I mean, that garden was incredible. It's in the book, and it was just astounding what was in that relatively small space for a Buxton garden. Ferneries, 15 aviaries, pond, glowworm grottos, 12 to 20 men worked on it for 2 years to create it, which gives you an idea. It's really extraordinary. Beautiful trees still. And there are still a lot of the structures are still there, but they have a very limited number of gardening hours compared to what Ben Sutherland had.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? A garden like that, wandering around, you get so much the feel of it, but also Yeah, and I think you do a marvellous job of getting the sense of the time too, with these rural women on farms and commissioning a garden that could cost $1 million and the equivalent now, and then they'd be feeding these gardeners and looking after them for something like 2 years while they put it all together. It's incredible, really.
Amazing commitment. But that was what they wanted. So, because the one there's a very nice one in Longburn, and they had Buxton's men there in 1915 to create an extraordinary garden, 5 ponds and all sorts of things, and then they had them back again 13 years later, and that was when they had 12 men there for 12 months, and so Mary Tanner had to feed and house them, and she got this lovely garden, but she must have known what she was in for, because she'd done the same thing 13 years before.
Extraordinary, isn't it? Amazing. Lovely. Kate, in writing fiction, how much do you stick to the facts of history and how much do you veer off for the sake of story?
So for this one, I read about a lot of the battles or the conflict, etc. But I didn't want to say that took place on that corner, So it was set in Okato, which I came from South Taranaki, so it was a bit harder going with the Okato, but I wanted to be honest to the guy getting the land, and I knew how it happened there, just visiting, talking about that. So I went back to the farm that had been in my family, and you could just look over a fence and see there was like 2 chimneys. That was all that was left. And then after there was a review in the Listener about it, a woman got in touch with me and she said, "My husband thinks you're talking about his family," which of course when I saw the names I knew it was the same family, my grandfather's sister. And she said, it's owned by Mrs. Brophy, who I think is related, and our son leases it. So we're talking 1860s, the land is still there, and somebody in the family is working it. So that was really cool.
But did you you stuck to the bones
of
those wars, those battles?
Yeah. And I say that in the back, that they were the things typical of what happened all over the country. So it's rather than say this happened on this corner, I've invented a small district in that area, but like Anne Enright does with the Green Road. She says, everywhere's real except for the Green Road. And so I found that a bit easier. And then one of my people who is Māori and a writer, he suggested we change the name of a very famous river there called the Stony River, just so we weren't tripping on people's toes culturally. And so we made it Boulder River. And then someone said to me, who lived in that area when they were young, he said, "You've got Wexford." He said, "Was that because there was Oxford Road down the road?" So people are finding their own links.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because Christina Sanders, whose book we've published, O Kiwi Brown, she was just saying recently at an event like this that fiction demands pace and tension and the compression of a narrative that real life doesn't give us. So historical fiction writers always go in and change things quite substantially. I was surprised looking online about this author Con Eggleton, who's done a number of historical series. His Khan series, he said he altered the order of the Sung emperors to allow scenes with one boy emperor that was living too late for his story, and he took out some of the princes because there were too many, and he made this Mongol general childless for plot reasons. So, I mean, some, historians who are, wanting their facts in their fiction, they're not going to necessarily find it, and I think it can get people's backs up. What do you think about that? You, Kate?
I'm sure something like Wolf Hall is not necessarily going to be true to the final nth, So I've used stories that were in the records of the writing of the time, the history of what was happening, maybe tweaked them a little bit. I'm trying to think of what one. But yeah, I've sort of used stuff that I read and, yeah.
I mean, I guess people expect you to make it up. Ultimately,
it's not totally made up.
Story,
I mean, the factual stuff's the factual stuff. The story's made up. Does that make sense? The story of the young man. Yeah. the girl in it, the mystery. It's more of a mystery, the book, really.
I think it's time for a couple of readings. So should we start, Claire, with you're going to read about one of the Buxton Gardens in the Wairarapa in Piranoa. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, lovely.
Thanks.
Can you read and use the mic too?
So this is one of the women who was on the list, so she commissioned a garden in her own right, and she was listed as Miss Sinclair of Piranoa. Anne Sinclair farmed at Burnside at Piranoa in the Wairarapa. Anne was the youngest child of Catherine and Donald Sinclair, who arrived in Petone from Scotland in 1855. In 1867, Anne's parents bought 90 acres near Piranoa and steadily increased their holding until they owned 424 acres. Anne, the sixth child and their third daughter, was born in 1862. About 1908, the original Burnside homestead burnt down. The fire apparently started by the male cook, who was drunk at the time. Workers returning to Burnside for lunch saw the smoke in the distance, but it was too late to save the homestead, which was rebuilt soon after. Anne ran Burnside for some years before her father died in 1914. The Sinclair women were capable agriculturalists, and Anne's sister Mary Ann also had a substantial sheep farm in the area. Until 1918, Mary Ann, her husband, 2 daughters and son lived with Anne at Burnside. The rest of the family eventually moved out, but Mary Ann's son, John Appiata Sutherland, known as Happy, continued living there with Anne and later leased part of the property. Happy was given his name after he was delivered by a Maori woman when the European midwife was delayed due to flooding. Some labour was employed at Burnside, but Anne worked on the farm too. This is mentioned in a newspaper account of her appeal against the conscription of Joe Gardner in 1917, where Anne stated that he was the only paid help on the farm. The appeal failed, so it seems she soldiered on by herself, at least for a while. Others were employed at Burnside at various times. The 1933 obituary of Robert Marshall says that he had been working on the Burnside farm for some years prior to his death. Sometime after 1918, when only Anne and Happy were living at Burnside, Anne commissioned Alfred Buxton to design a garden at a cost of £1,000, or $134,000 today. Sorry, it's 2 pages. Happy's daughter Jean Lang grew up at Burnside but remembers little of the garden other than its buxus hedges. The garden required a lot of upkeep, and Jean's mother wasn't fond of gardening, so her father put most of it into lawn. Happy's niece Anne Aburn recalls a circular garden at the front of the house on the left-hand side. This had probably been a rose garden and would have been the first part of the flower garden visitors saw as they arrived after winding their way up the drive, over the bridge and past the weeping willows and other exotic trees. In what had been the rose garden, Happy grew a magnificent crop of cabbages, leaving the surrounding lawn untended, to be cut hurriedly when Happy's father died and the funeral was to take place. After leasing part of Burnside to Happy, Anne continued to farm the remainder of the land until shortly before her death in 1956, at the age of 96. Anne bequeathed Burnside to the Presbyterian Social Services Association to establish a training farm for orphan boys. A legal technicality enabled the association to sell the farm and homestead, but at a later date, the Anne Sinclair Charitable Trust of Scholarships for Young Wairarapa Boys, no mention of girls, was established to give grants to various educational institutions in the Greater Wellington area. Today, the Anne Sinclair Charitable Trust provides farming scholarships for girls as well as boys. Now back in private hands, Buxton's sweeping drive still welcomes the visitor to Burnside. Along the drive, a pair of weeping willows lean and wave on either side of a small bridge, and the ubiquitous Chinese fan palms have self-seeded throughout the garden. There are other Buxton features too. Oregon pines, or redwoods, are planted at each corner of the garden, and more exotic trees, London plane trees, rhododendrons and camellias, are dotted around the lawn. The old asphalt driveway, now covered by gravel, and the small rockery and pond on one side of the house are all typical of Buxton's work.
So much packed in there in those very simple stories, isn't it? Like the war coming along and what that meant, that you might lose your gardener and then you've got to manage that all yourself. And in fact, the First World War is a big part of this book, isn't it? Because he had those memorial, the memorial gates and yes, you better have that. that were put, and other memorials throughout the country that put up. There were a number where the locals asked Alfred Buxton to do the gardens around them.
There were a lot in the Wairarapa and a lot in Canterbury, and they were either, some of them have very extensive grounds, and I think in some instances he designed the actual memorial, but in most cases he just designed the grounds. There's one in Masterton that was a whole sports ground, which was very extensive, and war memorials, all of New Zealand, basically every community was making some sort of memorial, and he seemed to be involved in quite a few of them.
And there was some stories again relating to the fairer side there, being the mothers whose sons had not returned.
Yes.
Even commissioning him to do a garden in memory of the son. And a lot of women were involved raising the money for the memorials.
Definitely, the women were very involved, and there's quite a lot on that, because there were several families that had gardens, Buxton Gardens, who lost one, and more than several cases 2 sons in the war, and one 3. And as you say, one of them had a garden made, sort of as solace, I suppose. But some really sad stories actually. Once you start looking, and that's sort of one of the interesting things I think about doing something like this, is you find out a lot more about what seem to be unrelated things, but are very relevant to New Zealand's history overall.
Interesting, thank you. Kate, you're going to read from a piece of paper. Where's the book?
The book is here. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's fine.
To keep me sidetracked before I start?
No.
There is the book. Thank you. I've got a little person helping.
Okay.
And I'm just pointing out that this chapter I'm reading, more of it was published in the Sunday Star Times in January. So
nice.
With a little disclaimer about some of the language in the historical chapter in the novel reflects colonial views towards Māori, which may be considered offensive. So, but actually I don't think it was anything particularly offensive, but they felt like we needed to cover that. Okay, so this is part of a chapter. Our journey took us across heavy seas by sailing ship to a place called Nelson in the South Island of the country. My relief at being on dry land again after days at sea was short-lived. Very soon after our arrival, we were led on to a steamer, the Phoebe, bound for the North Island. From there, we disembarked at the bustling port of New Plymouth. A magnificent snow-capped mountain loomed in the distance. Egmont, someone said it was called. As soon as we were off the steamer, 3 officers marched our motley group to the army camp on the edge of town. There they kitted us out with blue serge jackets, trousers, work boots and heavy coats, which we had to carry neatly rolled, slung over our chests, as well as haversacks and water bottles. "Where's our guns, man?" Dennis muttered in my ear in Irish. I saw a corporal look in our direction, told him to shut up. We'd be in trouble before we'd even begun. Captain Henry Wright, our new commander, greeted us with scorn as we lined up in front of him. "I asked for soldiers and got you lot, riff-raff." He got us all right, some of the men being penniless and drifting, found at ports around Australia. Others, like Dennis and me, had tried their hand at gold mining without success. None of us were really cut out for battle, not in any organised way, at any rate. The captain led us away from the township to a settlement called Omata, the trail through thick vegetation, taking us almost half a day. He set us making repairs to a redoubt and barricades that had been damaged not long before in an attack by the natives. "You'll be building plenty of these soon," he told us as we marched back to camp that evening. At night, a few men took off to the town to get drunk or find women, or both. "Plenty of them hanging around the places the lads go to," Dennis assured me. "Why don't you come out with us?" I refused his offer at first, but I finally gave in one night and allowed the gang to drag me off to a pub in a deserted part of town. The army men were welcome there and given a place to hide out back should any military police come looking for drunk soldiers. Any who were found would face a court-martial and be confined to barracks for up to 7 days. "Get yourself a nice girl," Dennis urged. I pretended to like one of the girls he pointed out to me. Aye, she's a great lass, I told him, but when he headed over to another, who seemed to recognise him straight away, I took myself to the back of the bar and hid there. A middle-aged man with a weathered face who was sitting on a stool in the corner took it on himself to buy me a pint. Franklin Taylor is the name, he said, reaching out to shake my hand. Me and the missus and the children are staying at the stockade here till our house is built. We've got some land allocated out that way, near the coast. Michael Flynn, I said, pleased to meet you. I can see you're a soldier and all, he said. Used chaps do good work for us, keeping us settlers and our women and children safe while we break in the land. I found myself ordering another drink after that, and another. When I wandered back outside, there was no sign of Dennis, and I was now drunk. I lurched towards a bench to prop myself against when a man, a giant red-faced hulk, came at me out of nowhere. You've been staring at my woman, he bellowed. I glanced behind me. I couldn't see a soul. No, it was not me, sir, I responded carefully. It was time to make a move. I headed towards a step and was suddenly propelled downwards. An angry face peered at me inches from mine. Listen here, young pipsqueak, the ruffian. He grabbed my shoulders. So, he was a great big fellow. I was too drunk to fend him off, so I closed my eyes, waiting for the punch, wondering if he had a knife on him. I thought about fighting back, but all my energy was gone. Then the man was pulled off me, his body thrust into a corner, and a punch delivered to his soft, flabby belly. He let out a moan, but he didn't get up. I looked up to see who had rescued me. Thanks, Dennis, I said weakly. You know, I was well and good. I was all set to handle it. Another landing standing beside Dennis laughed. Sure you were, he said. Dennis pulled me up so I was standing. What happened to the girlie, he asked. Did you steal the big bastard's wee woman? I didn't answer him. Dennis flung his arm round my shoulder. Back to camp for us. We sang Irish ditties all the way there. I wanted to thank Dennis properly for saving my life, but the words didn't come out. I owed him one. Dennis stopped mid-song and belched. Another time, I thought. He was an odd kind of lad, but a good sort. The very next day, the captain announced he'd given up waiting for properly trained reinforcements from Wellington. You're a bunch of idiots, but you'll have to do, he shouted as we lined up on the grass. There's fighting to be done.
Nice. Good fun, thank you. So, Kate, one thing, isn't it, with historical fiction, I've written it myself, so I know, is you've got to get the language right. You don't want any anachronisms in there. How do you make sure of that?
I've had a lot of people reading my work, so I think that helps a lot. It's sort of a team thing in the end. You're not just you writing a novel.
In terms of the language of the time, you mean people who are experts? Or they know?
Well, mainly like editors, lots, yeah. I got a manuscript assessment awarded to me. They have about 118 apply and they take 18 or 13. And Philippa Weary, who's very well known for writing historical fiction, historical books, she was my assessor, so she went through, line by line almost, with lots of good suggestions. And I'm in a writing group, they all read work. Then Rebecca, who's here, another friend is a writer with a PhD in creative writing, by the way. She read the whole manuscript and made comments. Someone else called Geoffrey Palmer, who's not the Prime Minister, that was. He went right through. So if you add up, plus then I had, just in general for the Māori stuff, I had 3 different Māori writers read it over. And someone who works, who's a friend of mine, he is Māori and connections to Taranaki North. He went through a lot of the stuff and then we were back and forth, just to make sure it wasn't stereotypical, the modern day Māori stuff or things like that. So I had a lot of input. One of the publisher's husbands worked for the Waitangi Tribunal as a lawyer, so he read all the war stuff and came back and said, yeah, it's fine. I did at one point have a beheading in there, and I think my writer friend who's Māori, that particular person, I don't think it happened, I think it was talked about in the memoir at the end, but anyway, we took that bit out. So.
Do you think it's important to get that sort of level of feedback?
I do. Just thinking about it tonight, I was saying to my husband, so I won't name this person who helped me out a lot, but he was at work in the government department. He's very senior, and he said to someone who was Māori, I'm helping this writer friend with her book, it's to do with the New Zealand wars and blah, blah, blah. And the person spoke in Māori and said, be very careful. And that's enough to freak you out for life. But we work very careful, and all the reviews that I've come across, in Landfall and other places, Otago, Daily Times, they all comment on how the research is very good, very sensitive. That's another thing, that the writing was culturally sensitive. And I haven't, as far as I know, had any complaints except one young reviewer who said something about, I didn't like Michael calling someone a dirty native. And I really swear I don't remember the word dirty. But sometimes people read what they want to read.
Interesting. Fascinating. Claire, did you have a lot of people read yours in manuscript form or as you went along?
Not really, just one. But every time I wrote up, when in that bit about Purno, I talked about Anne Ayrburn, and so she told me some of that stuff. So every little sort of bit I wrote up, I sent to the person whose garden it was, essentially. Like Jane Humble's, I sent what I was written about, just to check that I hadn't represented something in a way that they weren't happy with. And there's one garden in there, which a man told me about, and he was very critical of his grandmother, and I was a bit cautious about putting that in, but I did, and I sent it to him, and he didn't say anything about it, and he loves the book, so obviously he was happy for it to be in there. But I was a bit sort of nervous about that. So every bit was checked by someone different, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And
so
then
you felt secure in what you had gathered about that place, that garden.
Yes, well, more that I felt secure about what I had written related to what they had told me. Some of the factual stuff, like how much it cost and things, that was all documented, but it was more about the people side, which is sort of the more interesting side, and the characters, if you want to use that term.
Yeah, interesting. Wonderful. So I meant to leave a little longer for questions, but we do have 5 minutes.